The mysterious old lady at the cemetery. The person that I am today was all thanks to my big brother. Jason took care of me ever since we were little kids. We did everything we could just to get by. As two helpless lads who were abandoned by their parents before I could even walk, my brother needed to learn how to be a father at the age of 12. We grew up on the streets and different shelters. I was weak and often sick. I would have died a couple of times if Jason wasn't there for me. Since I couldn't make money because of my poor health and feeble body, he needed to work twice as hard so we wouldn't starve to death. With nothing but determination, he was able to send me to school and off the streets. Words could not describe how grateful I am to him, and I am deeply regretful that I didn't express my gratitude sooner. Jason was a tough and resilient man. After 4 years apart, I did not expect that our reunion would be in a graveyard. I was profoundly heartbroken for the passing of the only family that I ever had. I was looking forward to meet him so I could brag about my grades, and I wanted him to be proud of me. I worked really hard so I could one day repay the kindness that he showed me, but it was too late. He sent me away so I could finish my studies abroad. He frequently sent me my allowance and helped me pay for my tuition. I did not hear from him for a month, and then one day I received a message about his death. It said that he died in a car accident, but there was no other detail given. My brother did various things to make money. He was selling dropship items in the hood while also bartending in a pub. I assumed he was doing well since he was staying in a decent apartment while also providing for my financial needs. He had a lot of different jobs and hustles, too many that he eventually got tired of telling me what he was doing at the moment. He would always say that I shouldn't worry about the money and just focus on my studies, and so I did. I was so focused in my studies that I had no time to develop any form of relationship with other people. I didn't have any friends. My brother was all I had. I stayed beside his grave for hours on end. I was emotionally shattered that I lost the will to live. I stayed in the cemetery for days, for weeks, until a month had passed without me realizing it. I got soaked when it rained, and I was dried by the heat of the sun. I often slept at the bench near the tombstones without a care in the world. One day, someone finally spoke to me. I wasn't paying much attention to what was happening around me until this old lady sat beside me. I didn't have to face a mirror to know that I looked utterly miserable at the time. I was stinking since I didn't take a bath for weeks. My eyes were baggy and red due to crying and lack of sleep. I was starving since I barely ate while I was there. It wasn't a surprise that someone would feel sympathy for me. Without saying anything, she gave me a cookie and a bottle of water. I looked at her and she just smiled at me. I wanted to refuse her kindness since I didn't want anyone to feel sorry for me, but my dried lips and grumbling stomach suggested otherwise. "Missing someone?" she asked with a very gentle tone. I didn't want to respond, but tears just suddenly flowed across my face as I was munching on the cookie quite aggressively. With tears in my eyes and my hands jittering out of grief, I didn't need to say anything. She calmly spoke to me again and said, "Death is not the end of life. It is when you receive the fruit of your deeds and be bestowed by what you rightfully deserve." I thought that it must have been her way of trying to comfort a crying man without being intrusive. I was about to thank her for her words and the food, but I was distracted by the voices of children crying their hearts out. Not far from the grave of my brother, a mourning family was burying their dead. When I turned my head back to the old lady, she was no longer there. What she said to me back then gave me a different perspective about my brother's death. I was broken since I no longer had anybody in my life, but I did not consider my brother's side. We had a very rough life, and he deserved to finally rest and be at peace. I decided to go home and try to move on. Jason's passing was undeniably devastating, but I had to take care of myself on my own. After a few weeks, I was finally able to visit my brother's grave with a clear mind and unburdened heart. Unexpectedly, I encountered the same old lady for the second time. Like before, she gave me a big piece of a cookie again. I wasn't hungry at the time, and the chip wasn't as good as it was before, but I openly accepted her kind gesture with a smile on my face. Perhaps it was her wise words which motivated me to move on that I naturally opened up to her while nibbling on the cookie. I told her about the passing of my brother and how he took care of me while he was still alive. All of a sudden, the old lady shared a story of a man named Gregory Mills. Gregory was a clever man with 2 daughters and a wife. He worked his way up from the bottom until he earned a managerial position in the company he worked for. But this achievement did not come without getting his hands dirty. He did a lot of things to sabotage his competitions. But after all those efforts and dirty tactics for the sake of his family's livelihood, he caught his wife cheating with another man. Blinded by hatred, he murdered the man and his wife. He wasn't caught for the crime until he passed away. When her daughter sold the property, the buyer found the bones buried in his backyard during the renovation. I wondered why the old lady was telling me all of this as we walked around the cemetery. A few moments later, I saw two ladies standing in front of a grave that was buried just a while ago. I got goosebumps all over my skin when I saw the name on the tombstone. The person in the grave was the same man in the story. It was the grave of Gregory Mills, and the two ladies were his daughters. Baffled and mystified, I turned to the old lady who was just walking beside me a second ago, but she suddenly disappeared. After that day, I was beginning to think that the mysterious old lady at the cemetery was not an ordinary individual. She had this eerily calm yet enigmatic presence. I also realized that there was always someone being buried whenever she was around, and she had quite a substantial knowledge about the person who just died. What bothered me the most was the reason she might have for sharing the miserable life of a murderer who cheated his way to success when I just told her the humble beginnings of my brother. She spoke in puzzles, but there was always a deep meaning behind her words. How was it relevant to Jason? She always disappeared before I could even ask anything. I somewhat got an idea of what she was trying to point out at the time, but I refused to believe it. I looked up to my big brother, and I admired his efforts to make our lives better. However, there were a lot of things that I didn't know about him ever since we got separated. Out of curiosity, I looked up his records online, and I was utterly shocked by what I saw. Jason was jailed for different crimes several times. He was arrested for illegal drugs and possession of illegal firearms a couple of times. He was also a prime suspect for a number of unsolved kidnappings. They linked him with the cartel that was infamous for human trafficking and other heinous acts. I could not wrap my head around the things I just read. I knew that Jason was a hustler. He was selling fake goods and also committed a handful of other petty crimes in the past, but I couldn't imagine him getting involved with heartless criminals. I couldn't believe that all of those things had happened while we weren't together for the past few years. Everything seemed fine when we talked, but he probably didn't tell me anything because he didn't want me to get worried. I was devoid of the bitter truth in order to focus on my own life, but we were living off of what he earned from these horrendous wrongdoings. Knowing about his criminal records was already too much for me to take in, but to actually witness them was far worse. With a different perspective and a heavy heart, I went back to the cemetery to visit my brother's grave. Perhaps it was by chance or by fate that I came across the mysterious old lady once again. On the same bench where I saw her for the first time, I went ahead and sat right next to her. I had so many questions in mind that I didn't even know where to begin. I looked around and saw a burial nearby which supported my suspicion. I asked her if she was there for the person that was being buried. The old lady just smiled and did not respond to my question, and so I decided to bluntly ask who she really was. She remained silent, and I grew impatient. I asked her if she knew about my brother and if she also came when he was buried. I kept on spewing several questions one after the other, but she just handed me a cookie and told me to take a bite. Annoyed and frustrated, I threw away the cookie and began to raise my voice. She just smiled at me and repeated what she said before. She calmly asked me to take a bite. I was absolutely certain that I tossed the chip away, and so I freaked out when I realized that the cookie was still in my hand. Completely dumbfounded, I just did what she asked me to do. This time around, the cookie tasted nothing but a slab of mud. However, the awful taste was a beginning of an inexplicable sensation that occurred right after. All of my senses were taken over by vivid visions as if I was thrown in someone else's shoes in the blink of an eye. It was neither a dream nor imagination, but memories in the eyes of Jason himself. The kind brother that I highly respected was a criminal who treated other people's lives as if they were mere pieces of livestock roaming the streets. He was traveling with two other guys in a black van, and they would suddenly pull over to forcibly drag their unsuspecting victims inside. These people were kidnapped and drugged. They brought them to a place where they opened them up to harvest their organs and sell them. During the night when Jason died in a car accident, he was being chased by the police. Even though he did all these things for the both of us, such cruelty and inhumane acts would never be justified. Few moments later, my vision went completely blank. The next scene I saw was a horror beyond belief. I felt a waft of heat brushing against my face while a dreadful scene unfolded right before my eyes. Deafening screams and growls reverberated inside my head as I was seeing countless people squirming in a pool of fire, and one of them was my brother. Profoundly terrified, I looked away and turned my head to the side. On the ledge of the Gully of Burning Souls, I saw the old lady from the cemetery, illuminated by the flames. Her shadow was cast on a boulder behind her. It was then when I finally realized what she was. Despite of her calm and seemingly harmless demeanor, her shadow was a figure of a horned humanoid beast. The old lady was an emissary of hell. Her role was to take the sinners from their graves and bestow upon them the punishment which they rightfully deserve. I screamed at the top of my lungs until I found myself back at the cemetery. When I saw the cookie that I ate, I instinctively threw it away when I realized that it was nothing but dirt full of maggots. After that night, I never saw the old lady again.